Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. What is racism? And is there really any way to get rid of it in any society? Let's get to the bottom line. We have a special guest with us today. At a young age, he's turned Black American academic studies on their head, arguing that racism is about bad policies, not about bad people, not about bad ideas. He says that the only way to beat racism is for each and every one of us, whether white, Black, or brown, to look into our hearts and confess our personal bigotry and prejudice and actively become anti-racist. He is Ibram X Kendi, one of the nation's foremost scholars on racism, and he's just been tasked with building the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University. Ibram, thank you so much for joining us. I know you have a new book coming out, and it is called Antiracist Baby. I'd love to understand, based on what you've done on how to be an anti-racist, you're reaching further. What are you trying to do with this new book that you're releasing?
I think it's a tool for parents and guardians and caretakers and teachers to begin nurturing and raising the youngest of people to be anti-racist, to recognize human equality, to see conditions as problems, not necessarily people, to value all the different skin colors. And, the young people may not be able to fully understand race and racism, especially if they're 6 months or 1 year old, but we oftentimes teach 3 months old and 9-month-old and 1.5-year-old children about sophisticated concepts like love and kindness. And the older they grow, the more they understand it. And I think we should be doing the same thing with racism. And we should know that our kids are not colorblind. If we're not deliberately raising them to be racist, then if we're not deliberately, I should say, raising them to be anti-racist, then society is raising them to be racist.
Well, this is what I found is so powerful about the notion of reaching children, because you're also reaching their parents in the process. And you and I have talked about this before, that we come baked in. I came baked in with a certain assumptions from my parents in the community. And I now look back at that and I say, oh my God, that was entirely just an entirely racist frame. At the time, I didn't know it. So I want to applaud you for doing it. But I'd like you to tell our audience a little bit about the frame of racism that has been baked into us and what you believe we need to proactively do to undo those frames.
There's so many aspects of the frame. I mean, first and foremost, people believe that a racist is essential to who a person is, and a racist is essentially a bad person, and that it is a pejorative attack term, when indeed the term racist is a descriptive term. It describes when a person is saying a racist idea. When they're doing so, they're being racist. In the very next moment, if they're supporting an anti-racist policy, they're being anti-racist. So it's a descriptive term, describes what a person is, or what a person is doing. And then I think people are also taught to deny their own racism. And the way they deny their racism is when they're challenged for being racist, they typically say, I'm not racist. And so the term, the construct of not racist has always been this sort of sound of this denial. And I've been encouraging Americans to realize we're either being racist or anti-racist.
Well, when you hear about cases that we see now in the news before us, George Floyd being murdered, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks recently in Atlanta, this is now in front of us in video over and over and over again, people of color that have been killed. And while I know your book is about so much more than that, I would love to know what you think we need to do as a society to at least begin moving the needle when it comes to the way we think about security and policing.
Well, I mean, in How to Be an Anti-Racist in particular, I sort of examine the fact that, okay, what are our policies? What are the outcomes of our policies? Are our policies leading to racial equity and justice? Or are they leading to racial inequity or injustice? The current policing policies, what effect are they having? What outcome are they having? And we know that the outcome they are having, not only from the data, but also from the videos, the outcomes are injustice and even inequities, in which you take a city like Minneapolis, where Black people are about 20% of the city's population, but more than 60% of the people subjected to police shootings. That's a disparity. That's a problem. There are policing policies that are leading to that that need to be changed. And I think that the way we go about doing that is realizing that the people aren't the problem, that the policies are the problem. And we can change policies if we recognize them as the problem.
Do you think, though, I mean, I just want to challenge you a little bit about on that, if we change policies, I talked to Val Demings the other day about creating an office of law enforcement standards. Do you think that will stop that officer from killing George Floyd or sticking his, his knee into his neck? I mean, I get the notion about policies. I just, I've read much of what you've written about. This really isn't a bad people problem, but I see bad people out there, and I'm just want to challenge you a little bit to help me understand what you're meaning.
Well, again, I don't think that changing policies are going to necessarily result in no police officer, ever using lethal force, ever again. But when they do, there could be a reaction, or that they can think twice because they know Black lives are just as protected as white lives. So they will resist or choose not to do something that maybe they would have done in a different policy environment. And so their inclination is to continue kneeing George Floyd on the neck, but there's a conscious recognition that something will happen to them that is bad if they continue to do so. So then they stop, not necessarily because they are anti-racist, not necessarily because they value his life, but they value their own job, they value their own career, and they realize that we have a society now that values all lives equally.
When you and I have spoken in the past, I talked about growing up in the military and the Air Force, and my parents were supporters of a guy named George Wallace. A lot of folks won't know George Wallace, but he's one of the worst racists in American history. And it's something I hadn't realized until I got off as an adult that deeply disturbed me, that went through, and it created my own process of being introspective about what that meant and how it had been, it had hijacked some of my views. I'm interested, you also look at the fact that we all walk around with these racist frames. What is a process that you recommend for people to get into their frames and into their souls? Like, I did in the conversation about this horrible politician in my past.
So I think to define terms first and foremost. And so we should define what a racist idea is and what a racist policy is. And then we have to be willing to admit our own racist ideas based on this clear and consistent definition. And the way we interrogate whether we have any racist ideas is very simply to take any racial disparity, whether it's Black people disproportionately dying of COVID-19, or Black people disproportionately incarcerated, or Latinx immigrants disproportionately deported, and ask ourselves, why is this the case? And we're only going to really come to two types of answers. One answer is going to say there's a problem with society, there's a problem with racist policies, there's a problem with the conditions. And the other answer will say there's a problem with the people, that Latinx people are being disproportionately deported because they're animals and rapists. Black people are disproportionately dying of COVID-19 because they don't take it seriously, or there's something wrong with the way in which they take care of their health. Black people are disproportionately incarcerated, people will say, because they are more criminal-like or more violent. These are racist ideas. And so I think it's critical for us to interrogate our own ideas, and even, by asking us questions of why disparities exist and persist.
Now, are white people, or those that are in power, in the power structure, the only ones that are part of this racist equation? Can you have victims in this equation that they too themselves carry racist frames?
Oh, without question. I mean, to give an example, I mean, I think, for instance, if you look at the history of poor whites have been simultaneously the victims of racist policies that disenfranchise them based on this idea that black and brown people were being disenfranchised, or that prevented them from unionizing and organizing with black workers based on sort of white supremacist ideas. So then it affected their economic livelihood, their political livelihood. Just as you can have black elites who imagine that they're being held back not by racist policies, but by black poor people. And they are trafficking in ideas that there's something wrong with black poor people. And so, you know, I think that it's critically important for us for all of us, no matter their race or even class or gender, to ensure that we're seeing the problem as not racial groups of people, but power and policy.
Ibram, your book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, has shot up to the top of the New York Times bestseller charts and a lot of other books. My former colleague at The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, there have been a lot of these books that have focused on racism, racial identity. Do you think that the people buying the books are deeply interested, or do you think this is a moment where they're checking off boxes about how they feel about this?
I suspect it's both. I certainly think there are people who see it as a fad and certainly see it as a thing to do, but I know that there are other people who are serious. There are other people who realize now that racism is a fundamental problem that can no longer be ignored, that they have to learn about it. And the same about police violence. And those are the people who are going to join with us to really create a different type of country.
Now, you have in the past, in your book, you have said we need a Department of Anti-Racism in the government. We need a constitutional amendment against bigotry. Tell us more about that and what you have in mind. I mean, those sound to me like interesting and big ideas that become hard to enforce. So what do you have in mind there?
I think the spirit of those types. So yeah, a publication asked me, well, I give them a sort of an idea completely out of left field, but really the spirit of those proposals.
Don't you hate that when they do that? You know
exactly. And the spirit of those proposals was that first and foremost, I mean, if we were to create a nation where we defined a policy as racist based on its outcome. In other words, if any policy was leading to racial inequity or injustice, it was defined as racist, and it was seen as a policy that needed to change, then I think that would make a tremendous difference, because there are a lot of policies currently that are leading to racial inequity or injustice that are framed as not racist or race neutral, or people don't really want to acknowledge that those are problematic policies. Then we also need to be regularly looking into and studying policies and their effects. And we need people within government and other protective organizations protecting people against racist policies, protecting people against the harm that comes through racist ideas.
You become hugely popular, Ibram, in the communities that you're speaking to. And you used to, I know, go and speak before audiences all around the country, and they were mainly white audiences. Today you're on Zoom doing big Zoom meetings. But what would those folks, when you would interact with them, are there any of the stories that stand out in either the revelations that people shared with you or the attacks that came from them?
So I think two things that stand out. I think what seems to always stand out to me is when extremely young people, you know, like a 15-year-old student who's Black, who had read my book and heard me speak and came up to me afterwards and said, so basically you're saying there's nothing wrong with Black people. And that all of the people who think there's something wrong with Black people, they're the problem, not Black people. and that we basically need to change the conditions, and then things will be fine. And for me to be like, yeah, you broke it on down, certainly sort of stuck with me. Or an 82-year-old woman who said that she had no idea that she had held racist ideas for as long as she could remember, but she didn't want to die that way. She wanted to transform herself. Obviously, those are the things that stick with me. Or someone who is a conservative who comes to one of my talks and just assumes, by not reading my book, that my work is just challenging conservatives, when, if anything, it's challenging liberals just as harshly. So that's always funny.
When you are confronted like that, one of the interesting things, again, coming back to this time of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and so many of the injustices we've seen, people want to do something, and they may not know what they can do. And with all due respect, you're saying, hey, look inside yourself and look at your own stereotypes, look at your own racism. But I think a lot of people want an app, or they want a checklist, or they want some way to be told if they do X, Y, Z, that they will be better and they have done something that has improved the world. Now, I know that's a simplistic take, but I think a lot of people are there. Is there anything you think that can be done to help those kind of people who want to be well-meaning, but they need something a little bit less, fuzzy?
So if you want to sort of check off a box each year, one of the ways in which a person could check off a box every year is give a tremendous amount of money every year to racial justice organizations that are challenging racist power and policy. And I think that's absolutely sort of critical. I do think that people should be involved in the process of changing themselves, directly involved in the process of changing their society. But if they want to be removed, they can certainly donate money to these organizations that are certainly on the front lines.
When you were thinking about setting up an academic institution on anti-racism, and I know you've been at American University, now you're moving to Boston University, what are the key pillars that you're going to put in place that will give this resilience in these times, and that will help people understand what the pathways are to anti-racism?
I think on the research end, we want to be able to build teams of scholars and researchers who have sort of been organized to solve a seemingly intractable racial problem. And so we really start from the problem and then build skilled people from many different sort of sectors and research areas to essentially go about researching that problem. And that research wouldn't just stay there. It would then lead to evidence-based policy solutions. And so we're not only sort of building these research teams, but we also want to build teams, and we want to build connections to advocates and policymakers that can allow for the production, again, of evidence-based anti-racist policies that have the capacity to reduce inequities and injustice. And there are many researchers who want their research to make that type of impact. And certainly there are many researchers like that, at BU and throughout this country.
Ibram, was there an incident that happened in your life that helped you to understand that inverting this question of racism, or whether people said they were racist, but thinking about it in a more proactive way of reaching out and saying every day, or I'm going to reach into myself and become the opposite of that. What got you there? What was the experience, if there was one, that got you into that frame?
I think it was the experience of writing Stamped from the Beginning, my second book, which was a history of racist ideas, anti-Black racist ideas. And as I began to study the people who were producing these racist ideas, I saw person after person denying that their ideas were racist. So there wasn't just the production of racist ideas, there was the production of denial. And the sound of that denial was, in our terms, that they're not racist. And so, the more I heard that and saw that and read that, the more I realized that the people who also were fighting racism were also claiming that they were not racist, that didn't really make sense. And then there were people who believed that there was this sort of neutrality, that you can just do nothing, and if you're doing nothing, you're not supporting racism, when in fact to do nothing in the face of racial inequity is to allow it to persist.
I think finally, in light of that answer that you just shared with us, I'm going to be interviewing Angela Davis next week for this TV show. Mm-hmm. And I'm fascinated by her life and by her commitment and by her sacrifice at a time when, I think candidly, it was even tougher back then for folks to stand out than it is today. At least that's my perspective. You've been someone who has written a lot of great things about Angela Davis. So one question is, what should be my first question to her? But tell me about your own relationship with Angela Davis.
So, I mean, I've gotten to know her personally, over the last few years, and she's so gracious and spirited, and such a, beautiful, intelligent person. But I think my relationship largely with Angela Davis came from admiring her work, and admiring her sort of life, her lifetime of struggle. And oftentimes, people now are talking about the problem of police violence and the problem of mass incarceration, but she was talking about and advocating against that problem, since the early 1970s. And so, talk about someone who was ahead of their time, talk about somebody who was challenging the number of people being arrested long before there was mass incarceration. It's certainly, Angela Davis, and she was also defending Black single mothers when nobody wanted to defend them. She was also defending Black, obviously, poor people when no one wanted to defend them. And so she's really, throughout her public career, been defending those people that really no one wanted to defend, but she was willing to do so. And I think in terms of a question, what does it sort of feel like to literally be fighting, literally be ahead of your time, in so many ways? What does that feel like? And that finally, potentially, the country is catching up to where you were 40 years ago.
Well, Ibram X Kendi, congratulations on your book about to come out about children and anti-racism. But I want to thank you for all the contributions you have made to those of us who need to think about this every day. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? I've spent a long time thinking about the family I grew up in and how racist stereotypes get passed on. I have to be deliberate to make sure I don't perpetuate them further. And I have to be deliberate to make sure that I have a world of friends and colleagues that include people from every stripe. But nobody's perfect. We all still have a lot to do. Doing something to be anti-racist can move society to a better place, beyond tolerance for one another, but to actual empathy and understanding. And as my guest today says, that requires work on all sides of the race equation. And that's the bottom line.